You can drastically change the sound of a compressor by manipulating its attack and release. The way I see it, these settings are responsible for the tone of the compressor on the track that you're affecting. Getting them right is a little bit more of a challenge though, and I know because it was a struggle for me when I was first learning about compression. Sure, maybe I generally understood what these settings are supposed to do, but I wasn't as confident in how to set them properly, and most of the time I just sort of winged it. Now, if you're watching this video, chances are you're struggling with this yourself. You may even have specific questions like, what exactly does the attack and release do? How do they affect the sound of the track? When should I set the attack and release? What are the best settings to start with? How do I know if I should adjust these settings? And what exactly should I listen for when I am adjusting them? I had the same questions early on, but as I worked through almost a decade at recording studios, record labels, and my own private facility, I discovered the answers and more. So my goal is to share these answers with you today and give you a framework to follow when setting the attack and release settings on compressors in your own sessions. That being said, the first question we need to answer is, what is the attack? The attack time determines how quickly the compressor is going to react to the material once it passes the threshold. Essentially, how fast is the compressor going to react to turn down the material once it passes that threshold? Now, how exactly does this affect the sound? The faster the attack time, the faster or more aggressive the reaction from the compressor once the signal passes the threshold. The slower the attack time, the slower the compressor is going to react to the material. Now, slower attack times tend to sound more transparent or less noticeable, as they can let through the transients or the initial impact or peak of a waveform. However, it's possible to set the attack time so slow that the compressor barely reacts or doesn't react at all. For example, here's a compressed vocal track with the same settings, but the first time I play it, it's going to have a fast attack, and the second time I play it will have a slow attack. Listen and notice the difference in tonality and the overall reaction from the compressor itself.
I get the money in a lobby, I get the money in a lobby, and I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a lobby, I get the money in a lobby, and I go bring it back, hey.
Notice how the fast attack time produced a significant amount of gain reduction due to the compressor reacting to the material and engaging right away. Basically, it was cutting off almost 9 dB of volume when I had the fast attack time. This produced a much more noticeable compression effect, as you could probably tell. The slow attack time still produced gain reduction, but significantly less compared to the faster time, as it reacted more slowly to the transients or the initial attack of the vocal. Basically, it was losing a little less than 3 dB in volume, so obviously significantly less compared to the faster attack, and this created a much more transparent or less noticeable compression sound. So now let's take a look at the release. The release time determines how long it takes for the compressor to let go of the material and stop compressing it once it falls below the threshold. The next question is, how exactly does the release affect the sound of the compressor? The faster the release time, the faster the compressor lets go of the vocal and lets it come back down to an uncompressed or dynamic state. Now, opposite of the attack, a faster release tends to sound more transparent or less noticeable, as it won't keep the vocal compressed for long. However, if the release time is too quick, it could produce a noticeable pumping type of effect or a choppy, uneven type of sound and other negative artifacts that we may not necessarily want. So similar to before, here's a compressed vocal track with the same settings, but the first one is going to have a fast release and the second will have a slow release. Pay attention and just notice the difference in tonality and the reaction in terms of how it lets go of the material once it's no longer passing the threshold.
I get the money in a lobby, I get the money in a lobby, and I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a lobby, I get the money in a lobby, and I go bring it back, hey.
So again, you can see that there's a difference in the reaction and in terms of how long it's keeping that signal compressed for. With the faster release time, you can see the compressor letting go of the material pretty quickly and letting it revert back to an original dynamic or uncompressed state. It's still fairly noticeable as it's creating a bit of that choppy sound that we discussed. Now, the slower time, however, kept the vocal compressed for longer, basically never letting it go and keeping it compressed almost entirely, even after the signal would fall below the threshold. This produced a much more noticeable compression sound, and if you really paid attention, you would notice that we actually were getting a little bit more gain reduction with the slower release because, again, it was keeping it compressed and not letting it come back up. So we're actually losing about a dB more on average with the slower release time as opposed to the faster release time. Now, the reality is we likely need to find a middle ground between each of these settings to achieve an optimal amount of compression that doesn't negatively interfere with our vocal. However, now that we understand the two extremes of the fast and the slow attack and release times and how they sound, what they do, we could use this information to find the right settings for our actual vocal. So let's adjust this compressor and do just that. But the first thing you might be wondering is, what attack and release settings should I start with? I recommend that you start with a fast attack first and foremost. That way the compressor reacts to the material right away and starts compressing it. This is going to be a pretty aggressive setting, as you can tell, but this is a great place to start so we can hear the compression taking place right away and then dial it back and make a more calculated decision. I also recommend that you start with a fast release. That way the compressor lets go of the material and it comes back to an uncompressed or dynamic state as quickly as possible. Basically, this is a good in-between since the attack is pretty aggressive and the release is not as aggressive in this case. Now, of course, these settings are probably still going to be too much. We're probably not just going to set them and forget them. They're going to need some adjustment, but this should allow us to optimally hear the compression and make our adjustments accordingly. Now, keep in mind the attack and release on their own are useless if we don't set up the other settings correctly. And what I'm referring to by other settings is the ratio and the threshold, as that's something you're going to have on every compressor. Now, keep in mind there are some additional settings here that you may not necessarily have. These are particular to the compressor that I'm using, being the R-Comp. I'm not going to get into it here, but just know these settings are not necessarily as important as these others, but these first two, the manual and the electro setting, will affect the release time on this particular compressor. That being said, let's first talk about the ratio. Now, because we're compressing an individual vocal directly, we'll typically want to use a lighter ratio ranging from 2:1 to 4:1. As a refresher, a 2:1 ratio means for every 2 dB that goes into the compressor and passes the threshold, 1 will come out. It'll basically cut the loudest moments in half. And this is typically the ratio I use when compressing because it's more gentle, but you can absolutely go higher if you prefer a more controlled compression sound. Just keep in mind that the higher the ratio, the more aggressive the reduction effect is going to be. Now, with regard to the threshold, this will always be a unique setting based on your song, as the vocal level is probably going to vary from track to track. Ultimately, our vocal just needs to pass the threshold level that we set in order for the compressor to work. Once the vocal passes that threshold, the compressor will engage and create some gain reduction or volume loss for the peaks that pass through it. Now, I'm sure you're wondering when I say that, how much gain reduction should I aim for? Now, there's really no right or wrong answer. It's really going to depend on your track and, of course, your taste. A lot of stuff with mixing is subjective and there isn't necessarily one absolute. I'd say our goal to start should be to achieve at least 1 to 4 dB of gain reduction on the loudest peaks, bare minimum. I like to push the threshold well beyond where I'm supposed to go and just hear what it does. Hear how much of a clamping type of effect we're getting on it, and then from there reduce it. So even though I'm saying 4 dB, it might make sense to go a little bit beyond that and just see what sounds good, right? If maybe 5-6 dB sounds a little bit smoother or better to your tastes, well then hey, that's the right setting. Again, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong here. It's just about what suits the track, and I am going to show you some more ways to adjust these settings, of course, to make this reduction less noticeable or more transparent. So let's do it. I'll play this track, bring the threshold down, and let's listen and see what it does. I'm going to aim to try to get somewhere around 4 dB of gain reduction, but I might go a little bit beyond this or less than this depending on how it sounds. Here we go.
I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey.
So you can see that we're roughly achieving 4.7 dB in gain reduction on the loudest peaks. This is definitely a little bit beyond what I proposed of -4, but I think this sounded the most balanced. When I went really far at the beginning, I was achieving upwards of -7 dB of gain reduction, and that just felt like too much. The vocal started sounding really lifeless and dull, and that's definitely something that can happen with compression, but I want to make sure that I'm setting this in a way where we're not getting all the negative effects. We're trying to find that place where it's like, okay, this is pretty good. We could just manipulate it a little bit more to get that sweet spot to make it sound more transparent, more natural, right? And overall, I think where we're at, especially after I bypassed it and put it in, even though there was gain reductions, a little bit of a volume difference there, I wasn't really losing the life or the essence of the track. And I think that's what's most important to focus on. So now we can actually adjust our attack and release. And let's focus on the attack first. Now you may be asking yourself, how do I know if I even need to adjust the attack at all? What should I be listening for? In my experience, there's 3 main indicators you should listen for that'll help you know if you should adjust the attack time. Let's actually explore each of these and see if it's present present on this particular vocal track. The first giveaway is the transients. Play the track and listen to the initial transients or peaks on the vocal, right? These peaks that we were initially paying attention to earlier on. And a lot of times these are going to be consonant sounds. And on this particular track, I think it's more so B's and K's because he's saying a la becque. He's not necessarily saying some of these other consonant sounds like G's and T's and C's and things like that, right? So we're going to play this again and just pay attention to the transients or the peaks and ask yourself, are they drastically or noticeably being reduced? Are they being suppressed so much so that it's noticeable? And as you can tell, you could visually just look at your waveform and see where those peaks are, and then pay attention as your track plays and see how is the gain reduction meter reacting during this part, right? So ask yourself, are the sounds or peaks being excessively reduced? If you can audibly and maybe even visually notice that the transients are excessively being turned down, so when I say excessively, I mean by more than a couple of dB and it just sounds noticeable. It sounds like almost like someone has the volume fader and they're fully bringing it down and then back up, right? If you can hear that sort of effect, well, then you probably know you need to slow down the attack time so it doesn't react as aggressively. Let's play this track and pay attention and decide if that's a factor here.
I get the money in a la becque. I get the money in a la becque. And I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a la becque. I get the money in a la becque. And I go bring it back, hey.
So me personally, I notice it when he says money. I get the money. The M on the money kind of, it almost sounds like it's coming down. But surprisingly, when he says a la becque, the K is not necessarily coming down. Like that's actually still poking out pretty good. But either way, I do think that this is definitely affecting this a bit, and we're going to want to slow down the attack. Before we do that, let's evaluate the other two criteria that I'm talking about. The next one being vocal intelligibility. Basically, you want to pay attention to the intelligibility of the vocal. Do they sound less clear or less articulate? Are you having a harder time understanding what's being said? It might not necessarily be so obvious in solo mode, so you may want to do this in context. But if the attack time is set too fast, it can affect the initial syllables or words, making them sound less clear and kind of distorted or blurred together. Let's actually play this again and listen and see if this is a factor. And I'm going to do that by playing it and bypassing it and seeing which one sounds a little bit clearer. Here we go.
I get the money in a la becque. I get the money in a la becque. And I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a la becque. I get the money in a la becque. And I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a la becque. I get the money in a la becque. And I go bring it back, hey.
Not the most drastic effect happening here. I'm definitely still understanding the words and I think it's articulate enough, but it is happening a little bit, which could be just a product of the volume coming down with that gain reduction process. But nonetheless, I do think it is happening a little bit and we're probably going to want to reduce the attack. And I notice it more so at the beginning of the phrases, like I get the money in a la becque. Like the I get the money is sort of, again, it's a little bit of a stretch. It's not the worst, but it's definitely just blurring together a smidge more so compared to when I had this bypassed. So I think we could slow down the attack once again, but before doing that, let's evaluate the final criteria here, which is emphasized breath sounds. A fast attack time can emphasize or exaggerate the breath sounds in a vocal performance. This is because the breaths are usually quieter than the actual words or phrases, and as those words or phrases are getting reduced by the compressor because they're probably the material that's triggering the compressor, it could give you the illusion that the breaths are now louder since they're closer in volume. So you got to ask yourself, if you're in this situation, do your breaths suddenly sound a lot more noticeable? In this particular case, there's not as many breaths, to be honest. However, he does sort of breathe as he's performing in these last parts, I believe. He's saying a word, he's kind of sighing at the same time, a lot bit, you know, he's kind of saying it like that. And that could maybe be the only indicator here, but let's fully listen and confirm. Paying attention again to the breath sounds and noticing, do they come up in volume? Are they significantly louder or noticeable, more noticeable? Here we go.
I get the money in a la becque. I get the money in a la becque. And I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a la becque. I get the money in a la becque. And I go bring it back, hey. I get the money in a la becque. I get the money in a la becque. And I go bring it back, hey.
Now this one isn't too bad, but it does seem that the breath that's part of these phrases is coming up slightly since the initial transient or the attack of the phrase, the K as an example, is being reduced by the compressor, and then the decay part, which is where the breath is happening, so he's going K, and then that A right at the end, that decay part is basically coming up, or at least it feels like it's coming up, right? It's giving you that illusion, which makes the breath poke out just a little bit more than when I played it without the compressor at all. So again, we could definitely slow down the attack in this case to reduce the reaction of the compressor compressor and make this transition feel smoother. So basically, we're ticking all 3 boxes here. So let's actually adjust the attack knowing we've ticked all 3 boxes that I've talked about here. Our goal will be to listen as we slow down the attack to find a better place where the transients, the initial impact of the phrases, are not being reduced as aggressively. Our goal will be to listen as we slow down the attack to find a place where A, the transients are not being clamped down as hard, B, the vocal becomes more intelligible, more upfront and easier to understand, and C, where the breath itself isn't being as affected, where maybe it's not poking out as much as it once was, at least with our initial settings. So let's do this.
I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey, hey.
Now this seems to be pretty good, and you can hear how it sounds a lot more natural compared to where we initially started with that very fast attack. I definitely pushed the attack so it was a bit slower at times. You sort of saw me at the beginning really pull it one direction and slow it down, and you can hear how it just sort of opened it up and it was reacting a lot less aggressively, right? But that also meant that it started to sound less consistent, letting through way too many transients. So this setting is actually sounding much better. It's still on the quicker side, however, it's more transparent than where we started, and you can see we're still achieving some gain reduction and more control, but a little bit less so than, again, where we first started with that very fast attack. So now we can evaluate the release setting. And similar to before, you may be asking yourself, how do I know if I need to adjust the release at all? I think there's 2 main indicators we should listen for that'll help us know if we need to adjust the release. And the first one is vocal smoothness. To get a little bit more technical, we're really talking about the vocal's sustain and decay. By sustain, I'm referring to the steady state level of the vocal that's maintained consistently. Basically, when there is a consistent part of the vocal performance and it doesn't vary as much in volume or presence. Now by decay, I'm referring to the natural reduction in volume that takes place after the initial attack of the sound. So for example, this is the attack and maybe even part of the sustain part. It's the most consistent part, but then after you're having the decay take place where it sort of fades out, right? It comes down in volume after that initial impact. That's what I'm referring to. Now, if the release time is too fast, which it probably is right now, this can cause an abrupt release of the compression, resulting in a lack of sustain and in a natural cutoff of the vocal notes. Basically, it's going to sound choppy or uneven. So let's play the track and evaluate if that's present here.
I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey, hey.
Now, even though this is a fairly quick rhythmic rap performance, it's not always sustained like a singer's might be. The release setting still feels unnatural. It feels very abrupt, right? It feels like the vocals just coming in and out. And this leads to very noticeable level changes as the release lets go of the material quickly, which creates that, again, choppy type of uneven sound. So this means we're going to want to probably adjust the release so it's longer, allowing the vocal to breathe a bit more and sustain more naturally, which is going to enhance the overall musicality of the performance. But before we do that, let's look at the second criteria, which is artifacts and pumping. What you want to do in this particular case is listen for any audible artifacts or pumping effects that are caused by the release time. The reality is this is actually going to be more likely to happen if we set our release too slow after we adjust it. This is actually something we want to avoid rather than detect right now. So as we play this, we just want to be mindful that if we set our release too slow, it's going to cause the compressor to remain active for an extended period of time, which will result in a more noticeable pumping effect as it reacts to the vocal dynamics. It's basically already keeping it compressed, and then every time it passes the threshold again, it's pushing it down even further. And at the beginning of this video, you were able to see how we were able to achieve even more gain reduction as a result of having that slower release time. Obviously, again, something we want to avoid. So as we adjust the release, if we notice a pumping effect that it seems pretty noticeable, we're going to want to reduce the release time and try to mitigate that. We want to obviously find that middle ground between too slow and too fast. We want to avoid the choppiness and we want to avoid the pumping. We want it to just feel smooth overall. So let's play this and dial in our release and find that middle ground.
I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey, hey. I get the money in a la beke. I get the money in a la beke. And I go bring it back, hey, hey. I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey. I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey. I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey.
Now notice how I pushed the release to a significantly slower setting at first, which negatively impacted the sustain and decay, almost making them blend into one another. And the vocal just sounded less articulate, sounded a little bit more muddy, less clear, and it created a little bit more of that pumping effect that we talked about as it kept things compressed for a little bit longer than we wanted. The setting was overall just too slow to work, at least for my taste. Maybe you liked it, but I personally didn't. I wanted things to still be a little bit more dynamic than they were. So I ultimately backed off on this exaggerated setting and arrived at the one that you see, which is certainly more of a middle ground, still faster, more on the fast side, but not as fast as where we initially started. It's definitely keeping the vocal compressed longer than our initial settings, but overall it's creating a smoother sound. At the end of the day, when you're setting this, you want to make sure that things sound smooth. They don't sound super noticeable or drastic. And while you do notice when you A/B, that difference is not as big as where we first initially started. And of course, as we did this, you could tell that we're getting, again, a different gain reduction reaction. It's adjusting how much gain reduction is taking place. And now we're more towards that -4 dB number that I said. Again, not that you should fully strive for a specific number. Use your ears and your taste. But overall, I like how this is sounding. And we're obviously more into that optimal range of 1 to 4 dB, which is going to be a lot less noticeable in my opinion than if you did say a -6, -12 dB gain reaction. But of course, again, use your ears and your taste. Now, finally, we can add makeup gain back to our compressor here to make up for the volume that we're losing throughout this process. And even though we're losing upwards of 4 dB at times, we're not necessarily going to want to crank this up to 4 dB. Those are really just the loudest peaks that are coming down by that much. On average, we're probably losing a lot less volume, and therefore we don't need to add that much back. What I'm actually going to do is play the track and just bypass and put this in and slowly add gain and try to find a spot where they sound almost indistinguishable from each other from a volume perspective. Again, I don't want this to be slammed and significantly louder. I want this to be basically level matched with how it sounded before the compression even took place. Let's do that together. Here we go.
I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey. I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey. I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey. I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey.
It's very close. We're talking like within a point, 1.2, at least again to my ears. So now let's put the track fully into context and see how the compressed vocal is sounding. Depending on how it's actually sitting in relation to everything else, all the instruments and background vocals and whatnot, we actually may need to adjust our settings even more. Let's unsolo this and let's play this and see how it sounds.
I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey. I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey. I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey. I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey. I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey. I get the money in a la big K. I get the money in a la big K. And I go bring it back, hey, hey, hey.
So this is actually sitting really good. Maybe it's a smidge too quiet. Maybe I could bump up the vocals a little bit, but definitely when I take the compressor out and put it in, even in context, you could hear how much more consistent the vocal is even at a slightly lowered volume. Sometimes these are not just set and forget settings. Sometimes you have to continue to adjust them. Maybe you adjust the attack and release, you get a slightly different reaction. Now you got to adjust your threshold. You adjust your threshold, maybe you have to revisit the attack and release. It's sort of a little bit of a balancing act, at least in my experience. Now we all know to use compression in our vocal mixes, but do you know exactly what type of compressor you should be using? Click the video you're going to see on screen right now to learn about 4 popular types of analog compression and how to effectively use them in a mix. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe if you're new here. I appreciate you guys for watching, and I'll see y'all soon. Peace.
5